Okay, well, it's time for the box office top 10, brought to you as ever from our good friends at Comscore Movies, which is where we always go if we need a box office top 10. At 24, 2 tickets to Greece, please.
Which, I was kind of oddly charmed by. It looked from the outside like a complete piece of fluff, but actually, as the story moves on, it becomes more serious. And it's, I think, interesting to see a film addressing itself to a different audience, to the mainstream multiplex smashy crashy stuff. I liked it, and it was definitely a more rewarding film than I had expected from seeing the trailer.
Number 16 is Horde,
which I think is great. Now, I know that some people are finding it a tough watch. You were saying last week, is there more saliva than I think I can deal with? To which I think the answer is yeah. I don't know that you'd be a huge fan, but I think it's really, really impressive. And I thought that despite the fact that it's dealing with some fairly dark subject matter, there is something transcendent about it. And I really think the director, Luna Kun-moon, I think you will be hearing a lot more from her in the future. And I think people will look back on this as a very important first feature.
Number 10 is Taro, number 7 in America.
Which was not press screened. And there's this whole question now about... So it's a horror film based on a novel called Horoscope. And it's generally becoming the trend now that if distributors have got horror films, that they just can't be bothered to show them to the... They can't be bothered to show them to the critic, unless, of course, it's a horror film like In Flames, in which case they do, because that's a very good horror film. So I haven't seen Taro. I'm sure it's marvellous.
But you're not, are you? I mean, because it could be terrible. So
No, absolutely. I'm sure it's...
Because otherwise you'll get put on the poster.
Yeah, I'm sure it's absolutely marvellous.
Number 9 is La Chimera, number 29 in the States.
You see, this is interesting. I was talking to somebody who runs an independent cinema, and they are struggling to get an audience into La Chimera, despite the fact that it's had really good reviews. I mean, very, very good broadsheet reviews. And again, I can see why. I mean, Alicia Rovaka herself, the director, said, look, it's not meant to be an easy film. It's not meant to be, some films are meant to be challenging. But I know that they are struggling to get, audiences in. And the only thing I can do is to say, look, it's really worth your time. It's very hard to describe. Josh O'Connor is great, and it is unlike any other film you'll see probably this year. I mean, it is remarkable, isn't it, Simon?
Yes, it is. But I don't think Alice is helping herself by saying, it's not supposed to be an easy watch. There are ways of making challenging films and entice people in, and there are ways of making people go, oh, okay, well, I'll see something else then.
As Joe Strummer famously said of Side 6 of Sandinista, only the very brave go there.
Okay. Also, side 3 of Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds with the red weed. No one wants to listen to the red weed. Kung Fu Panda is at number 8.
Kung Fu Panda 4. We will almost certainly have I can't say it. Kung Fu Panda 5 is going. Kung Fu Panda 5 will definitely happen.
Kung Fu Panda definitely will be made by someone. Back to Black is at number 7, still in the top 10.
Doing well, great central performance. I mean, it is perhaps at worst an unremarkable pop biopic, but it's a perfectly decent pop biopic, and I think the great central performance does a great job of carrying it. And as we've said before, if you want the harsh version of this story, Asif Kapadia's documentary is out there. If you want a version that is more fairy tale, that's what this is doing.
New at number 6, Guruvayur Ambaland Anadayal. Apologies for if that's slightly...
No, well, I'm sure... I mean, your pronunciation is as good as, if not better than mine. This is Malayalam language Indian comedy drama. Again, hasn't been press screened. So if anyone's seen it, do write in and let us know.
Correspondence at KerbenandMayo.com. Challenges is at number 5 in the UK, number 5 in the States too.
My favourite Luca Guadagnino film, and once again, that's Josh O'Connor's second entry in this week's top 10. So, I think I know sexy tennis. Who thought you could make tennis sexy? And who thought you could make a playoff at the end of a tennis match actually the conclusion to a passionate love triangle? I think it's impressive.
New entry at number 4, number 3 in the States is The Strangers Chapter 1.
Okay, so this, again, not press screened. horror movie from Rennie Harlin. Rennie Harlin, who did that awful Exorcist prequel. You know, he did some other interesting stuff when he, you know, way back. So this is the reboot of the series that began in 2008 with The Strangers, which cost nothing, was very profitable, and was partly inspired by the Manson murders. And then there was a sequel umpteen years later, Strangers Prey at Night, which was kind of very 80s retro. It was actually perfectly well orchestrated. I mean, not remarkable, but fine. Actually, that one was worth it, for there's a very good swimming pool scene in that in the second one. This is guess what? This is the first of a projected trilogy, and I don't think they'll show any of them to us.
The word is trilogy. This will be discussed later in the programme. Number 3 is The Fall Guy.
Which, you know, I don't quite understand. We've had a few emails from people who've sort of who've not fallen for it, and there's been articles in the press saying, well, they misjudged how well known the IP was. I don't think it's. I don't understand it. It is almost a kind of textbook popcorn movie. It's 2 stars who you like, who've got great chemistry, and a bunch of action stunts. I don't get why people don't just go, oh yeah, it's a great popcorn movie. But some people I know really haven't gone for it at all.
Number 2 here, number 2 in America, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes.
Which, it's interesting. I do think the second hour of it really picks up. I think the first hour of it is draggy. Again, I think it's the trilogy issue, which is that once you know that you've got 2 other movies to expand the story and there's no need to get on. But I think what this does is it sets up a very interesting next chapter. And I think there are very good set pieces in it. Very incidentally, set pieces that are clearly influenced by Mad Max, which is interesting because we're going to speak to George Miller in a while, and you realise how much Mad Max basically laid the template of what a post-apocalyptic civilization looks like. But I do think it drags like crazy in the first hour.
And number 1 here, and number 1 in America, new entry, and that's If. So before Mark, a couple of thoughts. Very interesting, contrasting emails. Cameron says, following on from the Good Doctor's astute review of If, I thought I'd chime in with a few words. Whilst the film is absolutely fine, I noted that during interviews, John Krasinski said he'd made the film for his kids. As another podcaster previously mentioned on this pod, I think we're talking about Richard Osman, would say, make films for us and just spend more time with your kids. This approach of an adult trying to be imaginative leaves the end result a somewhat dumbed-down version of a fantasy. The film evokes so many other greater works that it struggles to find its footing. It's very much A Monster Calls. If they took out the personal tragedy and the adolescent growth, it's Inside Out without the empathy and vivid colour palette. It's Toy Story without the defining characters, all of which made it similar to the most recent Clifford the Big Red Dog film than anything else. Perhaps taking the film away from New York City and giving the audience a less familiar setting would have helped it to feel less pastiche and disappointing. Even the, in quotes, profound moments felt very broad, which is a shame as John Krasinski seems like the most wonderful man and the film clearly has its heart in the right place, but it's disappointing how the movie turned out with all the talent involved. Even the children sat behind me were bored enough to take their parents' phone and order nachos, and then persist to discuss the nachos midway through the film. Love the show, Steve, and down with the usual Nazi shenanigans. Thank you, Cameron. On the other hand, Stephen in Sunderland, I think this is very interesting. As someone who has never had an imaginary friend, and if as a child, not creative, I guess, I did relate to B being the 12-year-old girl who is kind of like the centerpiece of the show, and the growing up being forced on her through grief. Granted, my growing up came well into my adult life at 36, but losing my mam, it suddenly hits you. Oh, I'm grown up now. So seeing myself in B was an easy jump to make, despite the massive gap in age and sexes. Was this manipulative by the fantastic Jim from The Office, as John Krasinski will always be to me? I guess so, but isn't all art manipulative at its core? It's all created to elicit a response, and my response to Jim's writing was to become a 12-year-old girl and weep in my seat. I go to cinema or gigs to find that response in me, be it sadness or elation. So in that regard, If and Jim, meaning John Krasinski, were very successful in their manipulation. Beautiful movie, funny, charming, and any movie that can teleport a 41-year-old man from Sunderland across the pond into the mind of a 12-year-old girl is worth the price of admission. Stephen, thank you very much. So contrasting views on the number 1 film.
Okay, well, it's brilliant that Stephen had that response, because that is exactly what the film, is there for. And when we were talking about it being manipulative, I said that, the end, it made me cry. It pushed all the buttons and it made me cry. And I know you sat in a screening with somebody who kind of wept all the way through it. I think that the first email is is closer to what my reservation is. When you mention A Monster Calls, A Monster Calls is brilliant, and A Monster Calls is absolutely magical, and it completely works as a kind of magical realist fable. I think If feels a lot more contrived. I think the comparison with Inside Out is one that we made, and I think it's a comparison by which If doesn't come out well. I wanted If to be better, and I wanted it to be more magical, and I wanted it to have more of a transportative feel to it. And for me, it didn't. But if it did for you, and if you watched it and felt those things, then wonderful. And I think, again, it reminds us that so much of the way that a movie works is what you bring to it. The movie worked for you, and and that's enough. And I'm really glad it did, because I don't want it to not work. It just didn't particularly work for me.